Okay, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining. This is class number 3, series of classes we've been learning in the last 2 weeks. This is the third class called The Power of a Darkened Soul. We're learning, it's still a Purim discourse, and we're learning all about Esther being called Hadassa. So last week we discussed, let this be for his chus for refuah shalema, for frumit ba'asar rivka. You should have a complete refuah shalema. Today's class. So we were learning over here the idea of the panim and ochar, the face of the neshama, and the back of the soul, because we learned that there is a front and a back. And in the divine also there is panim and ochar. So what we discussed earlier was that panim, the face, or the pnimius of the divine, is the level of the light that doesn't settle into vessels, that is above the worlds completely, that doesn't settle in the vessels. That's called the pnimius of the light. The ochar of the light, the back of the light, is the light that goes into vessels, the levels of godliness that interact with the world. And in the soul, we also learned that we discussed at great length are 5 levels of the soul, but even the 5th level of the soul is only a name of the soul. Is only in a sense, a container for the spark of God Himself that's within the soul. And as we discussed earlier in the discourse, that comes from the level of Atik Omen, from the level of Ancient of Days, that is even higher than Adam Kadmon. So we're not talking about the specific Atik Omen, the specific Ancient of Days that surrounds Atzilus, the world of Atzilus, but rather we're talking about a much deeper Atik Omen, the level of Atika that's higher than the Gilgalta, that's higher than the Gilgolas, that's higher than the skull of Adam Kadmon. That's the point. So basically, it means the revelation of Or Ein Sof that's before the Tzimtzum, that reveals itself, its first illumination after the Tzimtzum. That's the original Or Ein Sof. And that level of Or is called Panim. And we learned that that's where the nitzutz of the neshama comes from. That's the pnimius of the neshama. How does it, and that's even higher than Yechida. That's the Yachid, that's the peace, that's the nitzutz boire. In the words of the Arizal, it's the nitzutz boire, it's the spark of the Creator that vests itself in the nitzutz nivra, in the spark of creation, which on the deepest level is the Yechida of the soul. But last week we learned that this nitzutz boire, the spark of God that is really at the core epicenter of the soul, which is called our panim, which he also said is the level of Yisrael. Yaakov is the level of the soul that becomes more creation-like or more vested in creation. But the point of the neshama that remains completely above the creation, it's called Rosh, Li Rosh, to me a head, which is a spark of literally of the original Or Ein Sof. So where does it express itself? How do we ever come into contact with that? So we were learning the idea that we have 3 types of love. This is the last point we learned. The love of Hashem b'chol levavcha, with all your heart. And then we learned there is a higher love called b'chol nafshecha, with all your soul. And then we learned that there is even a higher, deeper love called b'chol ma'odecha, with all your might. And the way he explained it in short was that in all your heart, b'chol levavcha, is a type of love that comes from a meditation that God is the life, the reality of everything that exists in the world. And in essence, everything that exists in the world should really not exist. That the material world, the physical world on its own, without the divine input in being imbued in it, is death. It decays. Not only it decays, it doesn't have an existence. So all of our retraction that we have to the material world, when we are not thinking about the spiritual content of it, in other words, when we're just taking the wrapper without the inner light of it, is a misguided attraction. It's a deception. It's really a deception. It's a deceptive emotion. It's an emotion based on a lie, because there's no reality to anything material. When one, obviously, however, to get out of this deception, we all live in this deception. To get out of this deception takes daily exercise of meditation. When we meditate that without God, nothing exists, that God is the life of everything, then we turn our attention from the love of the world to the love of the soul of the world. That's all that it is. It's loving the soul of the world, which is the life of the world. Just like when we love a relative of ours, a spouse, a parent, a child, it's clear to us really that we're not loving their physical, we're loving their spirit. Why? Because the moment their soul leaves their body, I mean, of course we respect the body and we respect it, but gone is, you don't have the person anymore. The person has departed. Even though technically you can keep the body in your dining room forever. I mean, it's going to decay. But no one does that. You can't do that because you realize that there's no one home. Because the body is only a shell. The body is only a wrapper to the real person. So just like in that sense, we understand that the primary being that we love when we love somebody is their spirit and in their soul. It's just enclosed in a body. So of course, once you love the person, you love them entirely, them as they are enclosed in their body. But when we love the material world for all of its pleasures and delights, and we fail to notice the soul, then, as we said earlier, it's very misguided. So how do we fix that? We fix that by reorienting ourselves and training our vision to, when we see the world, to see the godly pulse, the godly energy pulsating in the world, giving it, and then we love God, and we love God with all the love that we used to love all the pleasures of the world. We realize that God is the pleasure of pleasures. He is the pleasure of everything that we admire and love and are excited about. This level of love is called to love God, because He's our life. In other words, we look at the world, and by the way, this meditation only grows and grows and grows, because as we expand our understanding to take in our vision, our intake, that we appreciate that there's not just the physical world, but there are also spiritual worlds and spiritual worlds and spiritual worlds and spiritual worlds. And we realize that God is the life of all of that, then that creates a far more expansive wow. It creates an incredible admiration and excitement about the magnificent soul of all of it, which is God, who creates it, sustains it, and gives it all of its properties and all of its pleasure and all of its delights and all of its qualities that we're so excited about. And that's loving God because He's your life. But as we said earlier, that's the backside of God, that He creates the world. So therefore it's called Acharei Hashem. It's called the back of God, which is a beginner level, because we can't meet God's front, unless we first meet Him in His back. As it says in the verse, Acharei Hashem telechu, behind God you should walk. So the walking is the meditation of God's backside, which is His investment in creation to vivify and to enliven creation. And that's the first level of love. Then we learned last week that there is a higher love, a more transcendental love, and love God with all your soul. So what does it mean to love God with all our soul? Is when we take this love, but add some sizzle to it. Okay, we give it a kick. Just like you have, food could be good, but when you add sometimes a little spicy sauce, it gives it a kick. And what it does is it amplifies the pleasure to a whole different level, just because it has like the thrill, So the same is, it's a condiment. So here it's essentially the same love, but you're going to kick the love and give it such a good kick, meaning you're going to energized. I love how. You take it to the next level. And that is you meditate that this that I'm so excited about, the soul of life, which is the entire energy of the world, is only a ray, a tiny little ray of God's infinity. So it's nothing to who God really is. So in the beginning, it's like, God, you are the soul of life. I love life, so I love you. But that love is kind of like containable in vessels. Then there is a love that kind of erupts beyond the vessels. It's all consuming, because I realize that the God being the source of life, the source of everything that I'm excited about and I love and I'm attached to, that's the nether side of it. That's a tiny droplet, and he is beyond that. So I imagine what he is beyond creation. So that gives the love a sizzle. It's like pouring kerosene onto a fire. You have a fire already burning. That's the love. Love God with all your heart is the fire. You create a fire in your heart, a passion, a fervor, excitement, the fire. But when you throw on some kerosene onto it, and suddenly some lighter fluid, and the fire flares up. The flaring up comes from a deeper meditation. It comes from after we recognize the immensity of creation and the incredible power of God that animates and enlivens and sustains and brings it all into existence. Then when we realize that that's just a little spark of him, wow. So that kicks it up many notches. But then there is a higher love. And the next level of love is b'chol modecha, because all of this is still meditating on God's and his relationship to the creation. Either you're meditating on God being the source of creation, or you're meditating that the godliness of creation is still not the real deal. So there's something higher, but you don't really know the being that's higher. But then it says, love God with all your might. And that takes already a whole different level. You need to be a tzaddik. Every Jew has the capacity, but a tzaddik gets to experience this. A tzaddik meaning a very righteous person. What is that? After a person does all they can to know God through their meditation, then the spark of God that's within the soul, because it's a piece of God and not the godliness of creation, but as we spoke earlier, the spark of God, it's from the Atik that's above Adam Kadmon, which means it's from Atzmos. It's from really the essence of the Or Ein Sof. So from here, a person gets a sense of God's true reality, true existence. Not in a way of knowing. Very important words the Rebbe says. You can't meditate and know it intellectually because it's utterly beyond knowledge and the realm of intellect. It's an essential recognition. The soul knows God because the soul is of God. He says that was the recognition that Abraham had in God. And Abraham attained this level already when he was 3 years old. Ben Shalosh Shanim Hikr Avram es Boiroi. 3 years old, he recognized. This is called recognition. It's basically God makes himself be seen by the soul. It's an intrinsic recognition that the soul can experience. It's even higher than vision. It's an essential type of a knowledge. It's an essential awareness. This bonding is utterly limitless. Because you're talking about an internal and essential recognition of the essence of God, and being that God is utterly infinite, this love, this attachment, this bond, this call it an excitement, but is a limitless excitement. that knows no bonds and no limitations and no boundaries. So this is where we want, this is the ultimate dream, to get to such a state. And here's the beautiful thing. Even a soul that's in a body can unlock this dimension. And that's the meaning of, remember we said that the soul, as the soul is before it comes into the body, it's called Hadassa. The soul that comes down in the body is called Esther. Esther is concealed. But we say, Aster, Aster, Panai. The Panai, the Pneumius, goes down, is connected even when the soul goes into a body. The Pneumius of the soul, the essence of the soul is there. However, why does it say, Aster, Aster, I will hide it? One explanation is because it's essentially hidden. It takes a lot of work to extract it. But the deeper explanation we're going to learn today. And that is that during the time of, now this idea to be able to come to such a deep bond with God, to love God b'chol ma'odecha, with all your infinite might, to be attached to God on a divine level, with a divine love, not with a human love. That's the point, with an infinite love, is something that was far more accessible and reachable and attainable when the temple stood, when we were not in exile. In exile, this becomes almost impossible. And that's what we're going to read right now. We're starting chapter 7, and now this is in a Purim discourse that the Rebbe said in the year 5724, 1964. And it was said, it's called Vayhi Omen es Hadassa. And here we are. All of this was in the time when the temple stood. Then the divine light was shining into Israel in a revealed way. But in the time of exile, I will hide my face on that day. What does that mean? God's saying, I'm hiding his face. You realize, because here's the thing. In order for the soul to respond, to the soul to experience the spark of God, to recognize God himself, not God's energy in the creation, but God himself. Again, what this is and what kind of an experience this is, I don't know, because I've never experienced this. But this is like high. Who knows what this is? This is beyond prophecy almost. This is like a direct face-to-face experience with God Almighty himself. Like, what is this? But in order to experience, you need like this says in other places, Kirav Amor Elanitzutz. You need the luminary to come close to the spark. When the luminary is open to the spark recognizes, since it's a spark of that, it recognizes it gravitates to it, and wants to like attach itself, like a magnet pulling, one is being pulled. It's a completely super rational type of an experience. It's an insane experience. But that requires that God should be open to the soul, and that's when the soul feels swept up in this irresistible pull. It's almost a miracle that the soul can remain in a body when you feel this. Fine. But so, in the time of the temple, where God was living amongst the Jewish people, he was living in God was not in heaven, God was on earth. He descended here, he lived in the temple. So, this revelation was taking place. The face of God was present and therefore available. You had that Wi-Fi, if you can say. You had that signal that you were able to, a signal of God's essence that one was able to tap, to sense, and therefore the soul would start vibrating and attach itself. It would connect to it. But during the time of exile, God removes this signal. So it's like the Wi-Fi was shut down. So the source is not revealed anymore to the spark. So the spark is searching and searching and searching, but it can't make contact. It loses contact with its source. And that's the meaning that God says in exile, V'anochi astir astir. God promises that I will hide my face by Yomahu. So if God hides himself from the soul, so the soul then can't experience this. So we don't have that experience. So but in the time of exile, I hide my face on that day. I know. They do not give from above this special gift that is given from above, that the essence of the soul should be able to consciously recognize the essence of the divine. Again, this is not something that the soul can attain. It needs to be, God has to remove the veil and appear to the soul. So it's almost like prophecy. You can't attain it unless you can't open up a channel. God needs to communicate to you. See, here too, the soul needs to be, this is kind of like something that people would work on by meditating and meditating and meditating, and at a certain point, the meditation turns into a prophetic type of a revelation, in where you're not meditating anymore. The soul is being sucked into the infinite, because the infinite is revealing itself to the soul. So in the time of the temple, when God was revealing himself in this world, this was something that people would experience regularly. Obviously, not every Joe Schmo, but people who worked on themselves and refined themselves and diligently worked on refining and doing a lot of mitzvot and studying a lot of Torah and meditating on the divine, they reached such levels of connection, which was absolutely exhilarating and otherworldly. So that's what he says. God has to give it to you. Now, what's the reason why God doesn't give it during exile? Why wouldn't he give it? The answer is because during exile, in general, the Jewish people are in a fallen state. What does that mean? Because this is a gift that comes after you do all the work and after a person reaches whatever is humanly attainable to connect to God through one's own efforts. So then God matches our efforts and opens up the door for us, a type of window that we can't open on our own. But that's after we climb the ladder as far as we can climb. During the time of exile, because of the lack of service that the Jewish people were lacking in before the exile began. In other words, when God saw that we're not pursuing this open channel the way we should. So because of the lack of effort and the non-appreciation of our end for what we have, the gift was taken away from us. As he explains, and the reason for that is, first he gives another reason, and then he's going to give another reason, two reasons. The main reason why our face of our soul, our pneumius, our inner part of our soul, is inactive during exile, is because so again, let's understand something. The face of the soul doesn't mean only front. It means your inner core, the deepest interest, the deepest desire, the deepest craving that a person has. So from the soul, obviously, the deepest craving of the soul is to unify with the infinite, to unify with God. By the way, Mashiach is coming any minute, and we're all going to enter into these experiences, which is exciting to know. But in any case, the main blockage that doesn't allow, in addition to the fact that God is not pulling the soul, But the reason why God is not pulling us because we created blockages. The clogging. What's the clogging? When a person takes their inner drive, when a person invests, this is the point. I'm sorry, I'm having a hard time saying the words today. A little tired. When a person vests their inner drive, their deepest drives into the pursuit of the material pleasures of life. In other words, anybody who ever achieved heightened, very high levels of spiritual connection, it always comes at the cost of a foregoing on the physical pleasures. You can't have both. It's either you're pursuing God or you're pursuing the world. So, but God, we are people, we are physical human beings. We live in a physical world. God doesn't want us to disconnect from the world. So it's okay. We have to live a physical life, and that involves interaction and what we might say, not just interaction, but the experience of the physical enjoyments and pleasures of the world. But all of that needs to be done with external interest. It's like you do it. Why? Because I have to live. And if I have a little pleasure in the food that I'm eating, it's fine. But I don't make it the focal point of my day. My focal point of my day is not what I'm having for lunch. My focal point of my day is how my prayer is going to go. That's what I'm thinking about all day. I'm wondering when I'll pray mincha today and I'll daven Shemona Esrei, I wonder how flavorable it will be. But if all I'm thinking during the day is how incredible I'm going out for dinner and what I'm going to eat and so on and so forth and how delicious that's going to be, that's misplacing the deeper core of our soul. And I mean food, but that can be in anything. When we put our deepest inner imagination, that's usually what you imagine, the fantasy, our fantasy, our imagination. It's like what we're daydreaming about, where our soul is really craving. When we put it into worldly pleasures, then we kind of exhaust that energy, and we don't really have the pnimiyas haneshama, the deepest drive for God, because we've already exhausted it in the unholy things. It's like in every relationship. You know, when you're in a relationship with someone, I'm talking about in a marriage relationship, in love with someone. So your spouse or your spouse-to-be or your bride or your groom or your thing, generally are very sensitive to the fact how you are with other people. Now, when you are with other people, if a solid marriage, you're not worried about the other person's this. But here's the thing. Of course, as people that can be insane and they don't let their spouse or their whatever talk to anybody because it's ridiculous. Obviously, you're a person, you're social, you have people around, you're talking to people. But a sensitive soul can sense right away that your inner core, your inner excitement, your inner should be reserved only for the one you love. That's where that's there. And if one of the two sense that there is a inside attraction, an inside drive to something or somebody outside of the relationship, that can cause from the other side, the same thing, a withdrawal. That just, everybody understands that. That's a withdrawal. It works with God. God is also very sensitive. When God sees that we start getting, when we're giving our innermost, God wants to be in the deepest romantic relationship with us. He wants to be madly in love with us. But when he senses that our heart of hearts is not there and we're giving it to something else, that's like, so he's also like, okay. And when he, God forbid, does okay and he pulls away, there's no way we can then feel this. So that's what he's saying over here. It's kind of, and the reason for that is It's because the innermost of a person's soul is ba'ofen shel astir astir. The person is in a state of concealment. What does that mean? Shu inyan. This is the idea. Galu lebavel. Now, it says, the sages say, when the Jewish people went to exile to Babylonia, or when we went to exile to Persia, le'elam, galu le'edom, or the Jewish people went to exile in Edom, which the Alter Rebbe explains it spiritually, is not just a physical enslavement, but it means when the soul, a Jewish soul, is meant to be, it's meant to be in a bond with God. But when this the Jewish soul starts following the passions of Edom, the passions of the outside world, of the general world, which was not privy to such a deep relationship with God. So when the interests of the Gentiles become the interest of the Jew, that's a disconnect. The koyal yerida b'nyanei olam, which is referring to the descent into the matters of the world. That means worldly things, which is the domain of the Gentile. It says that Esau was given this world, and Jacob was given the world to come. In other words, Yaakov was given the realms of spirituality, and Esau was given this world. So when Yaakov, when the Jew starts to pursue the passions of the world with his heart and soul, in Yanei Olam matters, it doesn't have to be only even it can even be business. When we become so obsessed with it, it's not like, okay, I got to make a living, I got to do, obviously, or else, I got to take care of my family. But when it becomes making money and wealth and prestige and physical power or whatever it is, becomes an obsession to the point that it starts taking over the inner drive of the human being, ubefrat, and specifically b'tayves olam hazeh, with the lusts of this world, atchetoifes kol etzem nafshoi, to the point that the pleasures of this world occupy the essence of a person's soul. It takes hold. It grabs the person when the elements of this world take hold of the human being, not the external. The world is going to get you. But the question is it going to get you on the outside? Is it going to get you on the inside? It gets really dangerous if it gets us on the inside. The inside of a human being should be sacred to God. That's the way it should be. Externally, we're living in a world. And he says in Yiddish, es nimmt darum der ganzem etzem shaloi, it encircles. Now, as the person becomes so obsessed that there's no room anymore for other stuff because you get so obsessed with the pursuits of the material. So then this causes the concealment of the essence of the soul. So then you can't experience. So you could still have a relationship with God, but it's going to be on a human level. It's not going to be on the divine level that we spoke about before. And all of this is because but let's understand something. How did the core of the person's soul, this itself needs explanation. Good, we're saying we don't have, our essence is not available to be attracted to God because God's essence is pulling away from our. Why is he pulling away? Because we put our essence into the wrong things. But why did we put our essence? Where did the fall begin? That itself, how can a person who has a soul which is so much loftier than this world become so seduced by something so ridiculously insignificant in comparison to being in a relationship with God? How can that be? And the answer is, it starts from something else. In other words, he's giving you one reason, which is caused by another, giving you a whole diagnosis over here of exile. What's causing what? And that is, and that's because in the time of Golos, in the time of exile, we don't see our signs. What does that mean? That's a verse of Psalms in chapter 74, verse number 10. It says, our signs we don't see. It's lacking the idea of sight. I started saying it's lacking the sight, and I'm noticing I'm not seeing correctly. It's lacking the idea of vision. It's lacking the vision and the grasping of the neshama melubeshes beguf, regel shebeneshama. In other words, when we let down the guard on the lower service, remember we said earlier, you love God with all your heart, with all your soul, and eventually you come to loving God with all your might. And loving God with all your heart and all your soul, which is, remember, that has to do with meditating on God's greatness from within creation, and it engages the lower part of our soul, the part of our soul that's called the foot of our soul, the part of the soul that's invested in the world, in the body, as opposed to this higher transcendental part of our soul, which we're seeking in order to experience this bond, which is on a much higher level. But as we said earlier, prophecy and these deep experiences didn't just happen like that. A person needed to climb the ladder on their own end, how much they were able to do on their own, and then they would experience this moment where they would transition to something utterly divine, and it would be like a complete different experience, which you can't even compare. But you first have to climb the ladder. In the time of exile, there is a slacking off in the lower, because we're lacking in our meditation. Now, why is that? So let's not blame ourselves completely. It has a little bit to do with the fact that there's not so, in the time of exile, there's much more concealment. It's hard to meditate. There's a lot of confusion. We're constantly being whiplashed here and there from everything in the world that's barraging us, the constant distractions of life. In the time of the temple, life was very simple. Making a living was way, 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 way easier. There wasn't so much nonstop. So with all the distraction and all of that, it's very hard to focus. And as a result of that, when we don't meditate on the divine, we don't think about those earlier ideas, preliminary ideas that we spoke about earlier, how to think about that the world that we think of is so attractive and so exciting is really just a shell. And therefore we should love the godliness in it. Well, if we do this as a continuous, rigorous exercise every day, we would really feel these things. But it's so hard to do that because who has time and who has the mental focus to meditate? So when there is a general breakdown on the lower elements of the soul, which is the leg of the soul, it obviously causes that some of our internal element of our heart goes into the wrong things. And when that happens, for sure, we're not going to experience that much. Then there's a blockage between our pneumius, between our essence and God's essence, and we can't experience this higher love. So one thing causes the next. It's lacking the vision and the comprehension of the soul that's enclosed in the body. So that our love, that has to do with all of our heart and all of our soul. Remember, the way, there's 3 rungs to the ladder. All your heart, all your soul, and then finally we can come to all our might. But when we're lacking in the first 2, so this causes a concealment of God hiding his face. He's hiding it, and that impacts the essence of the soul. When there is an impediment on the feet of the soul, it causes an impediment on the head of the soul as well. Because if the service in our more immediate part of our soul, which means the part of our soul that is more accessible to us, the part of our soul that's vested in the body, the revealed part of our soul, the leg of our soul, the Yaakov of our soul, not the Israel of our soul. The more human powers of our soul. If all of this would be b'shleimus, if it would be in a completed way, then there would not be able to be a concealment and a block and a wall that's interfering in the essence of our soul. Like it says in different memorim, in Shabbos Shuvah memorim, in the discourses of Shabbos Shuvah, the Alter Rebbe says, it says over there, Shuvah Yisrael, do Shuvah Israel, return Israel, Ki kashalta b'aveinecha, because you stumbled with your sins. Ki kashalta b'aveinecha, because you stumbled with your sins. So the question over here is, it should have said Shuva Yaakov. Yisrael is a very high level. Yaakov is a low level. So the sinner is the Yaakov, not Israel. Israel is always attached. So it says a very interesting thing. Kashalta is to trip. Tripping happens, the feet trip. But when the foot trips, the head also falls. So when the lower part of our soul, which is called our feet, trips, which means is not healthy, is not in an appropriate state, it causes on very, very, very deep levels of our soul. It causes damage on those levels as well. Even though in that dimension we haven't directly sinned, but it gets kind of misaligned. There is a misalignment at the head as well. So when we're lacking in meditation, which should have been our daily exercise, our impact is taking place on a deeper level, that it's causing a blockage in our most sacred part of our soul. I know the even though, now he says in parentheses, hold it. He's challenging the thought that we just said. We just said that when there is an injury on the leg, it causes a deficiency in the head. Otherwise, the head of the soul, which is the face of the soul, which is the spark of God of the soul, that should, otherwise it would be revealed. It's only concealed. Why? Because of the damage that's done in the leg of the soul. Hold it. Isn't this level of soul in general very private? It's private. It's a hidden part of the soul. It's called the Pnimius HaNeshama, the internal part of the soul. It's a hidden part. So it's essentially hidden. It's not because it's hidden because because it's damaged. It's hidden because it's precious, because it's very lofty. It's very high. So therefore it's hidden. So he says, there's a very big difference between something hiding and something being blocked. It's always in a state of hidden, which means it always is not, it will take some work to reveal it. But with work, you can reveal it. But it's a whole different story when it's clogged and blocked. And even with work, you can't bring it out. That's the exile. That's what he's answering. That's what he's asking, and he's answering over here in the parentheses, right? Even though the essence of the soul cannot reveal itself, like the leg of the soul, the leg of our soul is far more revealable than the essence of the soul. But rather it stays in a concealed state. The concealment of the soul in its regular state, in a healthy state, is because the essence is usually private. Because it's essentially private. There's no obscurity. There's no guk blocking it. And definitely it's not a double blockage, a double obstruction. When is there? When does God say, "I will hide"? Not just hide. I will hide it. First of all, in when things are the way they should be, there's no hiding. There's just it's quiet. It's subtle. That's the point. It's very subtle. Since it's very subtle, it needs to be highlighted. You have to shine light on it to reveal it. But the idea that it should be hidden, and not just hidden, but hidden of hidden, that comes when there's an injury to the foot of the soul. When it's lacking in the avoda, in the revealed part of the soul, that's the meaning that we don't see our signs, that we're lacking in visualization and meditation and visualization, which comes from our own spiritual exercises that we are fully in control of, that we should be doing. But we're lacking. Why do we lack? Because it's exile. And exile is a harder time. Then it can be that also the essence of the soul, that the soul, that's why I call this class is called the darkened soul. This is what we mean, the darkened soul. The darkened soul is when the real light of the soul goes dark. Now, for most people, we don't even know what we're missing, that we should be too upset about this, that we should lose sleep on this. Like, okay. That's because we never functioned the way we should. It's like someone who was blind all their life don't know what seeing is. But for anybody that did see colors, knows how sadly, how pitiful it is not to be able to go through life and never see anything. Or that a deaf person can never hear music. How poor that is. This is a infinitely, indescribably more of a loss when we lose our divine spark that gives us box row seats to God himself. Front row seats to experience God. And when we lose that, and we don't even know what we lost, it should bother us. Like how is it that we lost that? But now he's going to explain, that's the meaning of a darkened soul. But now he's going to say that that notwithstanding the fact that the soul is dark in exile, there is something that happens, a certain magic that happens to the soul precisely in exile. You see, the soul reinvents itself the soul goes dark, and precisely in the darkness, there is some kind of we might call a metamorphosis that happens to the soul. I shouldn't call it that way. What I would say is a complete other element of the soul suddenly starts to appear precisely because of the challenge that happens to the light of the soul. The real light of the soul, the divine light of the soul goes dark. But the real power of the neshama gets turned on. Let's read it inside. Perek Ches. But now we need to understand. Based on what we said now, we said that the exile causes damage or compromises on the level of the essence of the soul, which means it causes a deficiency in our spiritual, on a very deep level of neshama, all the way up to the essence. But the question he asks is, in other places we've discussed, that's precisely during the time of exile that the essence comes out more. That the real strength of the Jewish soul emerges in the exile. So which one is it? Do we have more revelation of the essence or less revelation of the essence? And he's going to explain that both are true. The essence can appear in two ways. It can appear in a manner of illumination, that the essence shines. That we don't have in exile. That's an exhilarating, otherworldly experience of ecstasy and pleasure and delight that is just absolutely incredible. And when we have that light, we literally shine like the sun. We live in an exhilarated godly state. We're living in a level of a tzaddik like Reb Shimon Bar Yochai, like Rabbi Chanina ben Dosa, like, we're in a complete different zone of what, and when that happens, one loses all interest in every material thing. It becomes absolutely, utterly meaningless and nothing. We go into a whole different. That's the light on the soul. That goes dark in exile. But what does kick in during the exile is the power of the essence. The power of the essence is what leads us to hold on to God in a way that nothing can ever, ever, ever shake us off. A 1,000,000,000-mile-per-hour wind can blow on our soul, threatening to weaken our grip, and the soul holds on to God, and its knuckles get all white. You call when they call it white knuckle drive, when you're a crazy road that you have to really hold on to the steering wheel. Right? That kind of situation. The soul holds on to God with an infinite grip and will never, ever abandon God, even at the cost of losing everything. That comes out in exile. The power to give everything up for God. The soul does now. It doesn't have any appreciation for who God is and why it's doing it. It's absolutely an insane commitment. It's an attachment that God is my God, and I can never ever lose my identity as a Jew at any cost. And it's all it means to me. I don't know. I'm Jewish, and I'm just God, and like we see the hostages. Many of them, they were there, and they weren't religious, and suddenly they felt their Jewishness, felt their very identity as Jews felt threatened by these monsters, and they were willing to die not to eat on Yom Kippur because they felt that that's where they're holding on to God and they're not leaving God. Where did it come out? In the tunnels of Gaza. And it was precisely in the exile, suddenly the power of their soul came out. Not the light, the power. That's the idea he's going to develop over here now. It's gewaltig. We know and explained in other places the great quality of the service that is precisely in exile. Like we find by King David. That Dafka, when David HaMelech, King David says, when I was in the desert, when I was in the Judean desert, in a land of parched land and an exhausted land. It says when King David was running away, he says in Psalms, he says, my soul is yearning for you. In a land that's parched and thirsty. So it's explained, what does King David mean? In addition to the fact that he was running away in the desert and might have been thirsty. But it's a deeper thing. He's saying, I'm thirsting for you, God. When he was far from the holy temple. He was in exile. He was chased away. And he says, Masai Avai, when can I come? And I want to see God. But circumstances didn't allow him to come to the holy temple, to come into the place where we can feel the light. So he says, I'm thirsting for you from a far place. And then King David continues and he says, Cain Bako. Then he had a realization. He says, I have such an intense yearning for you, God, when I'm far away. I wish that when I was in holiness, that when I'm close to you, that when you're available to me, I would have even one iota of that yearning that I have when I'm far away. It's like in a relationship where you really love someone, and your heart yearns for them when you're missing them because you're far away. And then you would only say, I wish I would feel this way when we're together. And we're always together. It kind of gets, it loses sometimes that spark. When you're far, so David HaMelech is saying it. So he's bringing this as an example. It's not exactly the case. Because by King David, it came out in a manner of what? Of burning yearning, of feverish love to God. Here we're not talking about that. When we're talking in our exile, it's not necessarily we experience that yearning, burning fire. What we do experience, however, stronger is there's a stronger Mesiras Nefesh, there's a stronger state of self-sacrifice. Jews are willing to give everything up in the time of exile, which they never felt when they were in the time of the temple. So this rock solid or steel attachment. But he's using just as an example the idea that it says by David HaMelech, it says by David HaMelech that at the time of exile he was thirsting. My flesh is pining for you. And on this it says, came by Kodesh Chazisicha. This is, by the way, this pirush that I just said in this psalm, that's the Baal Shem Tov's explanation. The Baal Shem Tov explained King David's request that I wish when I'm not far, when I'm in a state of moichen de gadlus, when I'm not in a state of moichen de katnus, when I'm in a state of expansive consciousness, when I'm feeling you, I should have that excitement like when I'm far away and I'm yearning for the closeness. The Baal Shem Tov says, Kain bakod. It's so amazing. It's like, what's amazing to me is, like, you have different great people. Like, you have a word from Chaim Brisker, a word from the Meshech Chochmah. These are great scholars. A word, and they're usually like rich, deep, and like the Baal Shem Tov. Like, he says one word, Kain bakodesh. He says halavai bakodesh. It seems like it's but if you think like he's saying something that's revolutionary, it's like it's one short little word, but it takes the Baal Shem Tov. This verse in Tehillim was there for all these years, and no one read the Tehillim that way. And the Baal Shem Tov who was saying, I wish that every day when I feel you, God, and you're so close to me, I have those. I can only appreciate it and love it, like when my soul is in a state of darkness. Halavai b'kodesh chazisich. Bizman abayis in the time of the temple. Chazisicha ba'oifen avoda bizman agolos. In the same avoda that there is in the time of the exile. So that's one example he gives, that the time of exile has a certain superiority over the time of when the temple stood. And the same is also what the sages tell us. There's also a Medrash Chazal. Chazal say like this. There's a verse in Song of Songs which says, Ani yashena, I'm asleep. The bride says to her groom, I'm asleep, but v'libi air, but my heart is awake. There, right? It's talking about that my heart is always awake for you. Even when I'm sleeping, I'm really excited about being close to you. The Jewish soul is speaking about God, about its love to God. But the Midrash says that when it says I'm asleep, we're talking about the condition. The entire exile is called a sleep, a collective sleep. The world is sleeping. That Israel is asleep. The Jewish people are asleep. Ani Yashenu, we're asleep. But we're saying that even though we're asleep in Torah and mitzvot, it's like we walk around like zombies. We're not learning Torah like we should. We're not doing mitzvot like we should. We're not doing the commandments. We're not studying Torah. But the libi air, my heart is awake. The sages say, right? The heart, even in exile, the heart is awake. What does that mean? That precisely because we don't have so much Torah and we don't have so much mitzvahs, our hearts are more sensitive. Our hearts are yearning to do a mitzvah more than when we had the mitzvahs in the time of the temple. And the idea of the heart to pnimius haneshama. Now, the concept of saying that the heart is awake means that my pnimius, my innermost, my soul, the innermost of my soul is awake. But hold it, how do we fit this with what we said earlier? That but in the time of exile, there's a certain blockage on the pnimius haneshama, on the inside of the heart. How does this fit? And what we said earlier. That in the time of exile, name of Anochi Aster Aster Panai, I will hide my face. That the innermost of the soul is in a state of concealment. The answer is as follows. This is so beautiful because I don't remember seeing this so clearly and so beautifully explained in a mimer. Certain mimerim, you get a new insight. So what does it say? In every mimer, there's a new insight, but this is like a very rich insight. That in the essence of the soul itself, yesh oyer haneshama, there is the light of the pnimius of the neshama, of the internal element of the soul. And then there is koach haneshama, as we'll see in a minute. Hainu shepnimius haneshamu ba'ofen shel or v'gilui, that the inner dimension of the soul is in a manner of light and in a manner of revelation. And we'll soon see what the experience of that is in a moment, when that is. And that's in the time of the temple. That's when our internal part of our soul was in a manner of light and revelation. Yesh koyach haneshama. But then there's another aspect to the soul. It's called the power of the neshama. That the power of the soul, that the internal element of the soul is operating not in a manner of light, but in a manner of oomph, of strength. What does that mean? Light can never be covered up. If you covered up light, what happens? There's no more light. If you put a blanket on the light, there's no more light. Energy, however, you can put under a blanket. Koach can be invested. So when during the time of exile, where everything goes into invest in everything, the Jewish people are invested far more in the world. When the soul becomes far more vested in the body. So the light gets dimmed. The light shines much more when we're not under blankets and under the like, do you see there's clouds? The sunlight isn't there. So the light of the neshama doesn't work that well during the time of exile, when we're far more invested in the world. However, the power of the soul doesn't get weakened through hislapshus, through enclothement. Quite on the contrary, the more you try to block it, the more intense it gets, the more it hardens, the more muscle it builds. Elo shamaduber kan, but over here, when we're talking about koach over here, we mean the deepest koach, ala koach the etzem haneshama, on the koach of the essence of the soul. And the explanation of this in our service, what does this mean in the service of man? So now he's going to differentiate between when the light of the neshama is turned on and the power of the soul is. When the light of the innermost of the soul is revealed, then the service is in a manner of all your might. That means it's an inferno. All your might. There is explosive energy. There is excitement. One is singing and dancing to God. That's the experience. There's no limitation. There's no boundaries. And this love permeates all the powers of a person's soul. Suddenly all the powers of the person's soul is swept up with the light of the essence of the soul. And therefore, every power operates in super mode. The mind is illuminated with super illumination. And therefore there is great insight, there is great understanding, there is richness, there is innovation. And the heart, forget about it. It affects all the way down l'machshava dibur ha'ma'aseh, to thought, speech, and action. One's thoughts, one's speech, and one's actions are invigorated with this powerful light, are illuminated by the light. And therefore, everything is so refined. The thoughts are refined. The speech is refined. The actions are refined. So much so, if you think about it, you know that in the time of the first temple, they didn't have a siddur. There was no siddur. Judaism, it's like the most basic book in Judaism is a siddur. In the time of the first temple, there was no siddur. They had psalms from King David, but there was no siddur. No book of literature. Why? Because the words flowed from everybody. You had so much to say to God, you couldn't stop talking. You come up with your own word. You made your own poetry. Because it was flowing. There was a flow. And everybody was able to pray their own innovative prayers. And it was deep, it was real. But once the illumination of the soul shut down and we needed to be given a prayer book, and we used the prayer book to say praise, and our mind is flying here and there, and hopefully if we tune in a little bit, the words of the prayer book will kind of inspire some thought and some focus. But there it was spontaneous, because the light of the neshama was flowing through everything, all powers. And it was in a manner of, it was illuminated in a manner of light and revelation. This is active in the time when the temple stood. When the temple stood, when, as we spoke earlier, there was no barriers between God and the spark of God that's in our soul. They communicated really well. There was a powerful Wi-Fi. This illumination, the soul was turned on from its deepest point, and it swept through the entire human experience. Which isn't the time of exile. Then we are asleep from all of this. We're walking around like a zombie. We're asleep from all of these inyanim, from all of these matters. There is no illumination. There's no richness of the mind, the heart, thought. However, libi air, my heart is awake. What does that mean? The power of the soul kicks in when the light of the soul goes down. It's precisely when there's a blackout, that's when the generator kicks in. That's the point. The generator, the internal generator that generates a what? It's a fight or flight type of a thing. It's like there's no way, no one is going to mess with me. Inyan Mesiras Nefesh. It's almost like a panic mode. When a person panics, you don't have clarity of mind, but you have. It's not good to panic, but I'm saying it's like there's a certain like full thrust adrenaline that kicks in. The adrenaline of the essence kicks in when there is a threat, because we feel threatened. When our soul feels threatened, that's when this power kicks in. In Mesiras Nefesh, this is the idea of Mesiras Nefesh. This is not a situation and a condition. That the light of the neshama is shining in a revealed way, in all of a person's powers of the soul. But instead, there is hechlit kamor, there's a firm decision, there's a firm commitment, limsar nafshay al kiddush Hashem, to even be willing to give their life up for one's Judaism, for the sanctification of God's name. Notwithstanding this, gufa. And when is a person willing to die for his belief, for his or her belief, for his or her connection for God, to forgive up everything, even at the very same time when they themselves are not feeling it? It's not like a day before these people gave their lives, they were feeling exhilarated moments of ecstasy and prayer. They themselves were clogged. They themselves couldn't etch out any feeling. They're feeling dead inside. And yet, mysteriously, they stood up, and a moment when they needed, they stood up and said, you know what, no matter what, I'm fighting for my Judaism. I'm fighting for my connection to God. I'm going to do the mitzvah at any cost. How many people in Judaism, in the Jewish history, risked their lives literally to do a mitzvah? even though it was dangerous. And it's not like this is a person that when they're doing the mitzvah, they're getting what do you call it, pins and needles in their hands, because it's like suddenly that's getting tingling throughout their entire body because of the. It's not like Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Barditchev or tzaddikim like that who experienced like this divine No, simple Jew, but I have to do the mitzvah no matter what. That's Mesiras Nefesh. That's power. That's not light. It's notwithstanding the fact that the person himself knows there is concealments and blockages. This is even better. That there are objections and questions. What does that mean? There's contradictions. That means the very same person who's giving his life yesterday could have committed a big sin. There's the dark moments when you're not, person became enticed by something or whatever, and they lost themselves completely. Yet the very same person is going to give their life up for their commitment, for the mitzvah, for their connection to God. Even when there are, as we say, contradictions. Sometimes a person's entire life is a contradiction to their Mesiras Nefesh, to their self-sacrifice. And yet they're giving their life up. When push comes to shove. It's not illumination. There's a certain point where the soul is holding on to God and it will not let go, no matter what. And that is highlighted in exile. The inyan zeh, this idea, koach haneshama, the power of the neshama. Koyach HaMesiras Nefesh, the power of self-sacrifice. Hu bizman hagolus yoser. This is more active during the time of exile. Masha bizman habayis than from the time of when the temple stood. I know when that is. Shebizman habayis, in the time when the temple stood. Sheyeshna gilia oiresh shebekelim. There is a revelation of lights in vessels. Sheklolusam inyan hamoichin v'amidos. In general, it means that there is a full investment of divinity in the world. God is dwelling in the Ark of the Covenant, and He's dwelling it, which means the lights are coming into vessels. Everything is vested. So in the human being as well, the soul is vesting itself into the vessels. So there's great illumination in the mind. There's great illumination in the heart. That's all revelation. Then you don't feel that much the power of the soul because you're kind of distracted by the light of the soul. The light of the Pnimius and Neshama is distracting us from the power of the soul. Which isn't during the time of exile. When the lights go dark, the Eretz Tziyava Oyef in the land of thirst and exhaustion. The power of the intelligence. And the emotions. Which they are the emotions come from the mind. And when they are in a general state of concealment, as a koyach Mesiras Nefesh, then the power of Mesiras Nefesh, who begilu yoser, is more revealed than from when it was in the time of there was a great a rabbi. His name was Rabbi Yosef. I forgot his last. I don't know why it slipped my head right now. He was from he's a great. He wrote a Pirush on Pirkei Avos, and he was from those who were expelled from Spain in the 1490s during the Spanish Inquisition, Spanish expulsion from Spain. So he witnessed the heroic, incredible devotion that the Jewish people had to God, because they were invited to become Christians. And they said, no, they're going to remain. And they were wealthy, and they had to give up all their wealth and go into the most dangerous trek. Many of them died on the roads. Many of them killed. One of them were attacked. Many of them, they lost everything. It was the most. So he writes something interesting. He says, mostly it wasn't the intellectuals. The intellectuals weren't so quick on giving up their good life. When we say intellectuals, we mean intellectuals in philosophical understanding of, they can give speeches about God and so on and so forth and have a deep understanding. They were some yes, some not. But it was the more simple folk who, no matter what, who gave their lives up. So that was always a thing, an argument for the benefit of simple faith. The simple faith is stronger than than convictions of the mind. The pure faith of the soul. But this is what we're talking about over here too, the purity of the essence of the soul and its attachment to God comes out precisely when there's a compromise on the mind and on the heart, on the emotions. And to the point that we say, so much so that we wish ourselves that we should have such a level of commitment when the lights are on. As mevinch means we give ourselves a blessing. Halavai b'kodesh bizman habayis, if only in the time of the when the temple did stand, chazisicha, I should see you, ba'oifen avodah de mesiras nefesh ke bizman hagolos, in the same level of mesiras nefesh like we have during the time of exile. Now the general difference between the service in the time of the temple, the service in the time of exile, which are two complete different types, modes of service. Is the difference between the service that is called the service of refinement and the service of a test. Generally, we know that life, a soul comes into this world, and it's our main job is, that we're learning in Tanya now, is to refine the world. The refinement of the material world, of everything in the material world. How do we refine? So it's explained in many places. There are sparks of holiness that are in everything in this world, but they're mixed. The good and the evil are mixed. And through our work of using the objects, doing mitzvahs, or generally living our lives for a higher purpose, we separate the good from the bad and we elevate. Fine. That's called birurim. Then there is a different situation. Sometimes God does not put us in a state of doing a refinement, where our job is not a refinement, but our job is to withstand a test. Now, life in general is a test. Every moment of life is a test. But there are certain periods or certain moments that a person has in their life where God is particularly testing. We pray that God shouldn't test us. But there are such moments when we go through tests. So there is a very essential difference between the purpose of refinement and the repurpose of a test. When God is giving us something to refine, the purpose is God wants us to make a certain part of this. We're in service for God making the world holy. So the objective is not the person. It's not you. Like the Alter Rebbe says in Tanya, we didn't come down into this world for our soul's benefit. We came into the world for the world's benefit, which is what God, to do a service to God, to purify the world. Our soul doesn't need any rectification because our soul is perfect. Our soul comes into the world to purify the world. So in general, we're talking about everything we do, all of our Torah, all of our mitzvot, is primarily to fix the material world, to ready it for Mashiach. So then the objective is the spark of holiness that's within the physical thing, to reveal it, to uncover it, and to make the physical world a vessel, right? That's the objective. When a person is faced with a particular test, whatever that is above it, over here, the objective is not God, when God is testing a person, God at this moment is not focusing. God's interest is not that we repair something in the world. God's interest is that he wants to extract within the person himself, within the neshama itself. God wants to help the soul unearth within itself its deepest powers that are hidden in the soul. In other words, over here, the point is not a spark of the outside. Over here, the point is the soul should become stronger. We said before, a soul doesn't have to be repaired, but the soul needs to get to know itself. How does a soul get to know itself? When there are challenges and obstacles placed in front of the soul, and the soul would never realize that it has the power to make it through such a difficulty. And when the soul triumphs over all of its challenges and all of its difficulties, then the soul gets to see within itself a power that the soul never knew it had. That's another, and that happens mainly in tests. So when a person is faced with a test, we have to realize that usually the test is basically a lie. It's a facade. It says that most of the times when we're faced by tests, the thing that is challenging us looks to be this monstrous thing. It looks to be this darkness. It really is a piñata. There's nothing to it. And the reason there's nothing to it is because God creates a imaginary entity to look big muscle, looks like a big gorilla, looks like a mighty power. Since there's no divine interest in it itself, God wants it to challenge the person so that the person will bring out his strength. Once you reveal your soul, the strength, the purpose for what is, that thing will fall apart all on its own. That's the concept of an Nisayan. In other words, when we're in life, we are sometimes dealing with real things, and those real things there's some substance to it. And then the intention is that God wants you to purify that real thing and make it godlier. Sometimes God faces us with something that is not real. I know it sounds funny. I'm going to explain it in a moment. There are certain things that are not real because here the intention is not it. The intention is the person. So let me give an example of a test. And I'm going to give an example of a test that fell apart completely. Had no reality to begin with. It collapsed, and once it collapsed, it collapsed so much as if it never existed. Although it lasted for many, many years. The Soviet Union was a test to the Jewish people. God never made Stalin and Lenin and the Soviet Union exist because God wanted us to refine Stalin, refine Lenin, and refine the KGB and to elevate them. God wanted to bring out the strength of the Jewish soul. God wanted to have refuseniks. So it's interesting. You take a look the way the Friediger Rebbe dealt with the Soviet Union, it was very different than how his predecessors, the Alter Rebbe, dealt with the Tsars. See, the Tsars of Russia, they were a real entity. That was a real kingdom. It was corrupt, and it was filled with a mix of good and evil and had good potential. When Jews were living in Russia, and they served Hashem, and they in the lands of Russia, for instance, they brought about a certain refinement, like we do in the entire world. Like Jews in America refine the United States of America. These are real countries with real powers that need to be refined because ultimately God wants to reveal himself to the 70 nations, to the entire world. So the Alter Rebbe when he was in jail, he answered their questions when they were interrogating him. He made sure to give them respect and to answer their questions. He didn't defy them. When the previous Rebbe was in the Russian prisons, he completely dismissed them. He said he didn't want to answer their questions. When they gave him orders, he didn't want to listen. He basically told them, you're a bunch of liars. Because that's what they were. It was an Nisayan, it was a test. Now, it's a pretty serious test. Millions of people were killed by this test. But yet, there was nothing real there. That's why you saw how the Soviet Union collapsed overnight. They didn't even take even one bullet, I don't know what was fired. The whole thing came apart. Because there was nothing really ever there. It's an Nisayan, it was a test. That's the difference. So going back, the time of the Beis Hamikdash, in general, he says, the time of the temple was a time when it's a time when the Jews are in the world and our job is to refine the world. Exile, to a certain degree, the entire 2,000 years of exile, its primary idea is a test. That's why it says when Mashiach will come, what are we going to be? What do we say? Hayinu, we're going to be like Kecholman. We're going to be waking up from a dream. Like waking up from a nightmare. What happens when you wake up from a nightmare? You realize that everything that was so real and so whatever, it was just a dream. It wasn't even real. To a certain degree, God is messing with us during the time of exile for one purpose. During the time of exile, Hashem wants to bring out the koach of the neshama. You see, when you're dealing with real things, then you need light. For example, if you want to refine gold or silver, how do you refine it? You use light. You need illumination. In order to take out good from bad, when a dentist is working on your teeth, what is one of the most important things a dentist needs? He needs to pick a big light and put it in your face to look into your mouth, into a dark place. With light, you can separate good from bad. So the time of the temple, that was the time of refinery. We were refining the world. Exile, to a certain degree, you don't need light, you need power. And the point of the exile is to bring out the power of the Jewish people. Siras Nefesh. Obviously, there is an element of refinement that takes place in exile as well. But we're talking about over here the general thrust of Zman HaGolus, the Rebbe says, is bedugmas, is similar to Avodas HaNisyonos. It's related to the concept of a Nisayan, which a Nisayan is more to bring out the strength in the person that's going through the Nisayan. Let's read it inside. Between the avodah of refining, the avodah of birurim, when we do the avodah of the birur, hu ba'hadavar hamizbarer, we're doing our avodah in the object or in the entity that is being refined. There is a real spark that's within that entity, and God wants us to deal with it, to elevate it, to purify it. And through this, the entity that becomes refined through us uncovering the spark, because it itself helps the spark that's in it, then it too goes up to holiness. Meaning, it's not only the spark that goes up, but the encasement of where the spark is also elevated. The spark and the energy and the entity goes up. When we refine humanity is elevated. Not just the sparks go out. It's not like we're running away with sparks. We're bringing people to a greater consciousness of God. When it comes to an nisayon, a test, the The objective is not to elevate the entity. The thing itself doesn't have an existence. What does it mean? What he's saying is, it doesn't mean it's really just a figment of imagination. When the wife of Potiphar was trying to seduce Yosef, she was a real person who had a birth certificate. She wasn't some imaginary seductress over there that was trying to get him. And we know that was a test. So of course we're not talking that that an iso and his to. It means that the spark of God that's in it is like a dead spark. There's no real spark there. And God wasn't interested that Yosef should elevate her spark. God wanted Yosef to say no to her so that he can bring out his strength. And what happened to her afterwards? She just, whatever, she became a nobody. It's not about bringing her on board. It wasn't about that. It was just about nullifying the whole thing. Certain things, God doesn't want us to deal with it. God wants us to dismiss it, to break it, to make believe it doesn't exist, and to do what we need to do, and not become intimidated by whatever it is. Again, tests can come in many different forms. But a person has to be wise, and if you're not wise enough, you're supposed to speak to a mashpia in every situation to ask the question, is this a test or is this a bearer? How much am I supposed to pachka with it, or how much should I just dismiss it and not pay attention to it? When you meet someone on the street and you start talking to them about meaningful things and they ask questions and they challenge you with sometimes tough questions, you're not meant to ignore. You're meant to engage in conversation. And hopefully, if you're obviously ready, if you learn it enough, you can, even if the person is very challenging, you can give them some arguments and then change their mind to become more open-minded towards spirituality, holiness, and godliness. So you're meant to deal with them. Sometimes they're difficult, but you try again and again and again. But if you're praying and someone comes and while you're davening and starts shouting in your face because they see that you're praying and they want to disturb you from davening, like the Alter Rebbe says, over here, you're not going to engage in a conversation with them. Close your eyes and make believe they don't exist. And why is God doing it? God is creating something that this distraction has no real life to it, as he explains. There's no real spark there. It's only in existence as long as to intimidate you. But the moment and what's the gain? Because it forces you to go deeper in your prayer. The moment you've gotten that, the guy's going to go away. He's going to disappear. He's going to, I don't know, might drop dead too if he's a real bad guy. whatever if God decides. That might happen because he's unnecessary anymore. A test, in whatever that test is, there's no real spark there, like permissible things. Yidach, I'm sorry. What that means is the flame of the wicked, Yidach, will be extinguished. What does that mean? The spark that's in the wicked, you can't have even a nisayon, even a test. There has to be some divine something there. Because if it wouldn't have any divine input, it wouldn't exist at all. There is a spark. This is the idea of, we say a lamp. God is compared to a fire. So the lamp, the spark is like a lamp. But the nitzutz is like in a manner of it's extinguished already. There's no potential of elevation over there. That's why your job is not to elevate it. It's meant to poke you so that you can get stronger. The work that you're doing is to work inside yourself. It's not with it, it's with yourself. A person has to affect in himself to withstand the test, not to become not to become agitated or disenfranchised or discombobulated by whatever it is that's poking you. Sometimes you just got to do what you're doing and just Vayidezem is batless, and guess what happens? Through that, eventually, time will go by. Sometimes it happens immediately. Sometimes it might happen just a while later. The whole thing will disintegrate. You won't believe it that this thing that you thought was such a thing, suddenly, whatever. Vayidezem is batless mitzias hadavar. This entity that was getting in the way, shal yadei haya nesayin, which through it was the test. Because the whole point of it was never it. The point of it, God wanted you to bring out your own strength. And the power to withstand the test. And also, what gives the person the resilience to break through in a test? That's the essence of the soul. But that's the koach, not the light. That's not illumination. That's not exhilaration. Going back to the theme that we were talking about earlier, that's the power. That's the power of the soul to stand with Mesiris Nefesh. But here's the beauty. Once a person withstands a test and opens up the power of their neshama, once the power of the soul, you've unearthed the power of the soul and brought it into manifestation, you might get a bonus. What's that? That power of the neshama might suddenly fire off, as that power that you've just discovered might open up and do a firework display. And then you're going to experience also incredible, exhilarating light of the neshama. Sometimes when a person withstands a test, that leads a person to incredible spiritual revelation. There's a pasuk that says, and not only that, once you find your koach of the neshama, then a koach will trigger and it will illuminate the light as well. This is what it says in the pasuk, that God is testing you, ladas. Simply it means, it's a verse in Deuteronomy. It says God is testing you, ladas, to know if you love God. That's a simple meaning. There is a deeper meaning. God is testing you, ladas, to bring you to a state of das. And das is related to the illumination of the soul. Das means knowledge. This leads the person to the concealed das, haniskaliel sevav. Which concealed das? The recognition of the essence of the soul that recognizes the essence of God in a manner of recognition and experience. The B'chol Ma'odecha experience. That's called Das Hanela. Why do you need? In other words, because the lower Das, you don't need that. The lower Das, you can meditate on your own. You can come to that Das. The higher Das that is hidden in the essence of the soul, which we spoke before, the spark of God that's it, which is very private, which is very hidden. So through the Nisayon, through the test, through the power of the neshama, this gives us a handle to open up our das, the concealed das. Now the general idea of the service of a nisayon and a test that comes from the power of the soul, in general, the idea of koach of neshama is in the time of exile. This it says, if only when the time of the temple stood, when we were in a state of holiness, if only we can have access to such power like we have in exile. As we said earlier. With all of this, we will now wrap up the explanation on why Esther was called Hadassa. We're coming back, and now we'll understand, because Esther represents, the story of Purim happened during the time of exile. During a time when there was an incredible state of deep, deep darkness. Similar to right before Mashiach comes also, there's a great darkness in them. So that during that time, we have the Hadassa he Esther experience. He's going to explain like this. Esther represents concealment, which is exile, which is mainly koach of neshama. Hadassa, before we said earlier, Hadassa is tzaddikim. which is more related to the light of the neshama. Hadassa, he Esther means the two are interlinked one with each other. The light of the neshama with the power of the neshama. Let's see. Hadassa, he Esther. This is Hadassa's Esther. Dine. Bepirish Akasav in the explanation of the verse. She stands between the Hadassim. Sorry, not she stands. He stood. Remember we said a verse by Zechariah, I think it was, that he had a vision. And in the vision, they saw horses, men on horses. It was a prophetic vision. They were angels. And that the angel stood, these horses were sent to go scout out the land. And then there was a man walking, I think it was the angel Gabriel, and he was walking Bein Hadassim, amongst the myrtle branches. And it says, Bein Hadassim, it says, amongst the tzaddikim. The koyal tzaddikim, it's referring to the tzaddikim. Shal shmam nikra Esther b'shem Hadassa, which Esther is called Hadassa, like we said, because she was a tzaddikis, because she was a righteous individual. She was a saintly person. In the Isa B'Gemara, it says in the Talmud, so the Gemara says, Shahadassim em Chananya, Mishael, v'Azariah. Who are Hadassim? Hadassim, the Gemara says specifically, are the three tzaddikim, Hananya, Mishael, v'Azariah. Now let's remember who they are. Hananya, Mishael, and Azariah are the three great rabbis who lived during the destruction of the first temple era, and who Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, who exiled the Jewish people, was trying to force them to bow down to his great statue. And they didn't, and they refused, and with that, he cast them into a fiery furnace. And the miracle happened that they didn't get burnt, even though they were thrown into the furnace. So the Talmud says that they are called Hadassa. So now, if there's anybody who obviously faced a nisayon, a test, we said before that the test is supposed to bring out the essence of the soul, the real pnimius of the neshama, the koach, not in a manner of light, but in a manner of koach. That's by a test. Who was put into a test? They were in a test. They withstood the test. So in Chananya, Mishael, Azar, She'etzlam, in Nisayon, they had a test. Be'inyan shel Mesiras Nefesh. They had to stand in a Mesiras Nefesh, but by them, the Mesiras Nefesh was very, 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 very clear. See, a lot of people are, we're always living with Mesiras Nefesh. You know, when you do a mitzvah, you're not considering the price, or you're not considering the hardship. That's Mesiras Nefesh. But you're not really seeing Mesiras. The real Mesiras Nefesh is seen when you're actually taking a person and putting him into the fire, like they did. This is like Mesiras Nefesh in its most vivid way, in its most pronounced way. Now this again, Mesiras Nefesh doesn't come from the illumination of the soul. Mesiras Nefesh comes from the power of the soul. Now, however, we said they're called Hadassim because they're tzaddikim. Not everybody who has Mesiras Nefesh is called a tzaddik. Mesiras Nefesh means self-sacrifice, is by all the Jewish people, not just by tzaddikim. That's what the Alter Rebbe is saying, that every Jew is willing to give his life up for the sanctification of God's name. It's sometimes people don't do it because they weren't poked in the right spot. But when you poke them at a certain point, every Jew will give their life up. The question is how you trigger it. But everybody's got that potential. Hananya, Mishael, V'Azariah, what did we say earlier? That as a result of koach, you also get light. So they had both. They had the koach of Mesiras Nefesh. They had the light, the power of the soul, and they also had the light of the. Maybe because they were the generation who transitioned from the time of the temple to the time of exile. So they had they were a hybrid of both. The koach of Mesiras Nefesh and the light. To them, there was also the revelation of the light of the essence of the pnimius of the neshama. So when they're called Hadassa, it's primarily because of the light of the soul. That's what tzaddikim. But Hadassa, he Esther. What does that mean? Esther is also called Hadassa. So V'zeu Hadassa, he Esther. What does that mean? That even in the time of Esther. Esther in general means concealment. In a situation when God says, I will hide my face on that day, what does that mean? That it's not, the light of the soul goes dark. Not like by Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah. They enjoyed both. Very unique situation that they had both. Usually it's either the light or the power. So that's what we're saying. Even in the time when the light goes down, and it's a time of concealment, that the light of the soul is concealed, the essence of the soul has an effect even in the darkness. Not only even in the darkness, but in many ways precisely in the darkness. Because that's when the essence starts to vibrate in a manner of power, not in a manner of light. Koach HaNeshama, the power of Neshama, Shu Inyan HaMesiris Nefesh, which is the idea of Mesiris Nefesh. Al Derech HaMesiris Nefesh, the Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, Shenikra Hadassa. Similar to the Mesiris Nefesh of Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah that are called Hadassa. So what we're really saying is like this. When it says Hadassa who Esther, by the way, we're not just talking about the girl, the woman Esther, the queen Esther. We're talking about the Jewish people in that period of time. We're all called Esther. And what it's saying is that even when you're in an Esther state, you have the Hadassim inside of you. What's Hadassim? Tzaddikim who have access to their Pnimius HaNeshama, they're called Hadassim. Those who experience B'chol Me'odecha, with all your light, with all your might. In a strange way, the Hadassa is present even in the Esther. What does that mean? The highest Pnimius HaNeshama, even though it's Aster Panai, the face is concealed in a manner of light, but Hadassa he Esther. The Hadassa, the Pnimius HaNeshama that is always remember we said Hadassa is because she's receiving from Hadas, the level of the Neshama when it's still in Atzilus, when she's receiving from Hadas. Hadas is Chesed, Gevurah, Teferes, the three myrtle branches. We spoke about this. In other words, the state of oneness with God comes down even when it's not in a state of illumination. It comes down in a state of potency, in a state of power. Even when we cannot arrive to the level of Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Which by them there wasn't only koach, there was koach and or, there was power and light. But kol makom, nevertheless, yochelamid ben Isayim. A person can withstand the test even when there's no fireworks, even when there's no light. But oifen shel mesiris nefesh, in a manner of mesiris nefesh, k'moy shahoya b'yamei Esther, like it was in the days of Esther. Shenikreis Hadassa, that she's called Hadassa. And the power is, where does it mention Hadassa he Esther? Right in only the beginning of the Megillah, when it says Mordechai raised her. He Omen es Hadassa. He, Mordechai, was the one who raised Hadassa. Why does it say it over there? And Hadassa he Esther. That's the only time it says Hadassa. Because it's really dependent, he says. A very good way to keep this power of Mesiris Nefesh kicking by the Jewish people. Although sometimes it will come out even when there was no Jewish education at all, like we see with the hostages. Even if there was no Jewish education. However, if we really, really want to strengthen that the Esther should be strong, that the Hadassa he Esther, that even when it's a time of concealment, we should still have the power of the essence of the soul, at least in a manner of power inside of us. You need to have the idea of Omen as Hadassa. What's that? Mordechai should Omen as Hadassa. And he says it's good Jewish education. And even if it's Jewish education at the time of exile, which is it's lacking all the bells, the frills and bells, whatever they call it. It's lacking that. But you're still giving powerful, potent, drip, as he explains in a moment. The idea is The Masha Kasav Omen, and he was raising her. Well, Derech Masha Kasav, it's similar to what it says, Ve'eya etzloi Omen. It says regarding the Torah says about itself. It's a verse in Proverbs. It says the Torah says about herself, I was by him, Omen. I was, and one of the meanings of it is, I was educated by him. God educated me. The Torah is educated by God. God raises the Torah up. From God develops the Torah from. So the sages say on the word Ve'yetzla Omen, the sage of Isal Zeb Medrash Rabbah, says a Medrash, Reish Parshas Bereshis, the beginning of Parshas Bereshis. It is so beginning of Bereshis that this is the first Midrash Rabbah in the entire Midrash Rabbah. Actually, this word that he's going to say now, it's the first Midrash. to find the Midrash Harishon. It's the first Midrash. The Midrash Rabbah begins with the Rabbi Oishia, who was the one who made. He says Ve'eya etzloi Omen, and it gives this seemingly cryptic statement of what Omen means. Omen, so the Midrash says Omen padgud, Omen mechusa, Omen mutzna. That there's three meanings to the word Omen. Omen padgud means a like a nurse who nurses a child and educates a child, who like I don't know how you would call a padgud. A padgud is like they used to have kings, and people would have a special servant who would be the like the educator of the child. I forgot what it was called, like the teacher, the special name. Amen, what? Like a tutor, like a private tutor that was there for the child. That's a padgud. So the Torah, it says that the Torah says, I was tutored by God. Omen mechusa. Omen also means, Omen comes from the word I was concealed, because the Torah was concealed. And the commentators of Medrash explain that this is referring to a deeper part of the Torah that is more concealed by God. And Omen Mutzna is a level of the Torah that's even more concealed. It's hidden. Mechusa means covered, and Mutzna means hidden. So what does that mean? Mavur b'makam acher. It's explained elsewhere. So it's a hard Medrash to understand what a Medrash exactly means. But in Hasidus it explains, Barucha she'omen mechusa ka'al mitzvahs. That the mitzvot of the Torah are called Omen mechusa, covered up, because through mitzvahs we get covered, our soul gets covered with holy garments. Ki kisrei mechusa al yedei levushim is through garments. V'amitzvahs nikram b'shem levushim, and the mitzvahs are called garments. Omen padgug means a tutor. V'omen mutzna, and Omen mutzna, a Omen, which means hidden. Kol al Torah is referring to the Torah. So again, mitzvahs is the covered, the Omen covered, the Omen nurse, and Omen hidden is referring to Torah. Why? Omen padgug koi al pe'ula satorah b'derech shel padgug. When we say Omen, which means translated as padgug, which means a tutor, is referring to the effects of the Torah on the person in a manner of padgug, mechanech, which means a tutor, lechanech es adam, to educate a person, which is more shezeu inyan nigla the Torah. It's more the revealed part of the Torah, which educates us on how to behave. It's like an instruction manual. Omen mutzna, and the Omen mutzna, which means the hidden Omen, where Omen means hidden, Koyal Nister, the Torah, is referring to the hidden part of the Torah, which is not so much educating the person, but rather allowing us to get a peek into the inside of the divine, the hidden world. There's the practical Torah, and there is the hidden Torah. When it says that Mordechai was raising Esther, we apply all three Perushim. He uses the word Amon. He gave her education and mitzvahs. He studied Torah with her, the revealed part of the Torah. He gave her infusions of the hidden parts of the Torah. And as a result of that, she turned out to be Esther, hi Hadassa. So what the Rebbe is saying is, through Jewish education, where we educate our children with mitzvahs, we educate our children and we learn with them Shulchan Aruch, Torah law. We also learn with them Tanya. Whatever it is we give, these things nurture the soul. That when a person grows up, they can become, even though they are in a state of Esther, and you can rest assured they're going to be Hadassa hi Esther. They're going to be Jews. They're going to be powerful and strong, and nothing in the world is going to shake them. Even if they might not have a full illumination of the light of the soul, they're still going to have the Hadassa element, which is the part of the soul that's always attached to the God, is going to manifest even in the Esther, even in the concealed state. No matter whatever concealments they'll have in their lives, this education will be infused in them to bring forth the stubbornness of the soul, the power of the soul, which comes from Pnimius and Neshama, in the manner that it reveals itself during the time of exile. The Omen as Hadassa, he asked through the education of Torah mitzvahs. Omen, hinegam b'mayim d'matzah shel Esther, Esther, even in the states of concealment, paneh b'yom Esther, yesh b'koicham shel b'nei Yisrael, there is in the power of Israel, lamoid b'nisayin, to withstand the test, b'oifen shel mesiris nefesh, in a manner of mesiris nefesh, which is Hadassa. Now we come to the last paragraph quickly. Now this is important to the general story of the Megillah. Why? We need to know. When we read the Megillah, we read the story of Purim, we need to know. In other words, a lot of times I have people that ask me the question, Gaval, there's so much assimilation. There's so much people, so much darkness. So you need to take comfort and know that even though Bnei Yisrael amdu was b'mayim d'matzav, even though the Jewish people seemed to be in a very weakened state, they were then in a situation shayam makom l'gzeira v'oinish. The Jewish people sinned, so therefore they were in. The Rebbe doesn't want to say what I said. They sinned. He says they were standing in a situation that there was room for a decree and for a punishment, which means that they were not in their best. They were not in their best spiritual state. And since there was a state of concealment by Israel down here below, like we learned earlier, and therefore this caused God to hide his face as well. Nevertheless, God never rejects us and never repulses them to destroy them completely. Like the Gemara says, that Hashem did not cause them, God did not allow them to perish, to become completely annihilated in the days of Haman. Why? Esther. So what does the Gemara say? That God says, I made sure to provide them with leaders like Mordechai and Esther who can hold them strong in their darkest moment and then elevate them. What does that mean? That means that God always provides, that there should always be the empowerment of that we should have somehow or somewhere or nowhere. There are those who educate the Jewish people, those tzaddikim, those Mordechais that are around that enable the Jewish people to have the spiritual nutrients that they need, which is the education of Torah mitzvahs, which this strengthens the soul, Esther. That even when the soul falls into a state of concealment, but when she doesn't feel in an open way her inner light of her soul, you should recognize you should be able to see the effects of the educator in the educated, that the education that they received when they were young, maybe they only went to Jewish day school, they got a little bit Sunday school, whatever it is, but they got a little mitzvahs, a little bit that itself imparts into the soul powerful spiritual nutrients to be able to awaken the soul. And this power, that when push came to shove, and they wanted to, God forbid, destroy all the Jewish people, and they had a chance, As we explained other times, the Jewish people had a chance to save themselves and their families by relinquishing their Jewish identity and melting into the melting pot of Persia. They could have done it, but they didn't. They stood the entire year with self-sacrifice, which comes from the power of the soul, that comes from the innermost of the soul. And again, the Rebbe is blaming it. What gave them access? What activated it? Their education that they got. So even though they weren't turning out so beautiful when they were living, when things were going good, it seems like they forgot their education. But the education that was planted in them from they were very young went into them, and when the moment came when they needed to spring out like a lion, that fierce, powerful resilience came out. The Inyan Zeh Paul Bittel Gezer. And what did this do? This nullified the decree. Once they uncovered their resilience, remember what did we say? The whole point of the test is just to bring out the strength. And what did this lead them? This led them to La Yehudim, to the Jewish people, like it says in Hoysa Oira was light, the simcha and joy, the sasain and gladness, the yakar and honor. Basically, once they discovered their power, the light also kicked in. Everything kicked in. In other words, the juices started flowing, not just the power, but it kind of refurbished and rejuvenated their entire soul. The Kaim of Kibla Yehuda Valzarim, and now they went and they accepted the Torah all over again. The Ad to the point that the days of Purim will never depart from the Jewish people. This created for us a whole new holiday that will never go away. The Zichron LaYosef Mizaram, and the memory of this great moment will never go away from the Jewish people. Shafilu, that even in the time we know that Purim is greater than all the holidays. Shafilu kasha kol sifrei neviim yeh. We know that even in a time when all the books of Scripture are going to be nullified in the great light of Mashiach. In Megillas Esther loitibata. Megillas Esther will always shine with a beacon of light. It will never become dull, her light. We will always be inspired by Megillas Esther, even when we're going to have all the future books of the future. Megillas Esther will always be an inspiration. And so should be to us. But we should see it in a revealed and tangible way. Al Yedeya Inyan the Yakar Elu Tefillin. Today, basically, the Rebbe is saying that through the Tefillin, the Rebbe started Miftzah Tefillin. I think this was even before the Rebbe launched the major campaign, but looks like it was already brewing in the Rebbe's mind to already launch the campaign of Tefillin. In other words, by giving Jews the opportunity to put on Tefillin, this is gonna. The Rebbe says, if we can't have full education, let's at least slap a pair of tefillin on everybody so that they energize their soul. That's what he says. It should be to us through the tefillin, we should also have this power. The hiksha kol haTorah kula tefillin, because the whole Torah is compared to tefillin. Klolas haTorah and mitzvahs. V'chinuch b'zeh, and the education in this. Shezeh inyan v'hi Omen es Hadassa. Hina yedei zeh yakuyim, all of this, through this will be fulfilled. Masha kasev. V'ro kol ha'am ha'aretz kishem Hashem nikra lecha. All the nations in the world will see that the name of God is called upon you, which it says particularly is referring to the tefillin. The Yadarim Mecca, they will fear you. Begula seinu amitis vashlema, and our true and complete redemption. Bebias Mashiach tzidkenu bekarav mamish. The coming of Mashiach tzidkenu, let it be speedily in our days. Mamish. This we concluded this very special.